I'd like to welcome on stage Paul Ari Ednard, the MD at Ecobank, Côte d'Ivoire. Welcome, sir. You get to sit right next to me, so I can interrogate you more than all the others. I would like to now welcome Georges Weger, the Deputy Head of International Retail Banking for Africa, the Mediterranean Basin and Overseas Group Société Générale. Excuse my French. Georges, welcome. Please skip a seat because we're going to have Albert sitting in the middle. You can sit, just skip a seat for me, the next one. No, the next one, thank you. There's a reason for that, I'll explain in just a second. Lionel Zinsu, the founder and managing partner of Southbridge Group. Round of applause, please, for Lionel. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much. Please sit next to Georges on the other end. Thank you so much. And a big welcome to Bertrand Badre, the managing partner and founder of Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. Round of applause, please, for Bertrand. Welcome, sir. Okay, I'd like to now welcome, at the end, please, thank you. I'd like to now welcome our expert who's going to give us analysis before we kick off the conversation, Albert Zerfak, the Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. Albert, welcome, sir, and the podium is yours. Gentlemen, please take a seat. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Eleni, for the introduction. It's an honor and privilege for me to speak this morning to give you a couple of facts about Africa macroeconomic outlook. So I have a couple of slides and quite limited time, so I'm going to be going fast, so I beg for your indulgence if I go extremely fast. So as you've heard this morning, Africa is certainly facing a multitude of exogenous shocks. And we certainly see Africa's macroeconomic outlook clouded by three global shocks. I know most of us have Ukraine on our mind, but what is quite clear coming out of the numbers is that the crisis in Ukraine, which is the third image on this slide, is just exacerbating two previous extremely important shocks to Africa. The first is the climate shock. Climate shocks, between the 70s and now, the number of floods in Africa has been multiplied by 10. The average number of droughts has been multiplied by 4. So all of that has actually placed Africa in a very, very fragile situation and leading to a high risk of food insecurity. And came COVID in 2020, that led to the first recession Africa has experienced of the past 2 decades, plunging Africa's growth and certainly affecting most of our economies. So those shocks have had significant impact on growth. And at the global level, as you can see here, and these are the most recent projections from the World Bank Global Economic Prospect, global growth is decelerating significantly. But the good news here is that Africa is having a perfect square root recovery. Basically, what is happening is that Africa's economy, from the growth perspective, is not collapsing as some have predicted. We're just having a slowdown in our recovery. So from minus 2% in 2020, we're projecting that sub-Saharan Africa will grow certainly around 3.6% in 2021 and probably a little bit less 2022, but by 2024, hopefully, we should be back on that track. But what is of concern, however, is that growth potential of sub-Saharan Africa is not yet back on its track, contrary to other regions of the world. But the consequences of these concurrent shocks has been huge, starting with commodity prices. Yes, commodities were already rising before COVID hit, before the Ukraine crisis, but since the Ukraine crisis, prices of commodities, especially extractives, but also all minerals and food commodities have exploded, as you can see on this chart on your left. And inflation has been rising tremendously, while the average rate of inflation in sub-Saharan Africa had actually come down to less than 3%. We're now seeing inflation above 6% in Africa. And this is certainly driven not by a huge stimulus, fiscal stimulus, as we have seen in advanced countries, but by supply disruptions, supply chain disruptions, and the high dependence of Africa on imports. And we're seeing also weakening currencies. The Ghanaian cedi, for example, as you can see, have depreciated by more than 30%. So policymakers are actually facing a huge dilemma. And on the fiscal policy side, the question is, should you consolidate or expand? Consolidation, fiscal consolidation, is certainly needed to avoid further boosting demand and leading to more inflation. But it's also important not to stifle the potential for recovery. So in Africa, we have seen two sets of policies. A number of countries have been consolidating, but there are a number of countries that are also going completely counter-cyclical, expanding their fiscal largesse. So primary balances, as you can see, for countries have certainly deteriorated for a third of African countries. So on the monetary policy side, the question is, should we hike rates or not hike? Here again, it's certainly very, very country-specific, but more than 7 countries in Africa have actually decided not to hike rates, but actually lower them. Most of African countries have actually increased their interest rate. But again, here we need to find the right balance, and this is what all the those trade-offs that need to be made by policymakers in our countries, depending on the situation in your country. But then we have a serious issue of financing. Debt has been rising before the COVID crisis. It worsened. But the question is not if we should borrow or not, is how to borrow without sorrow. And this is certainly about what the debt is used for. And what we have seen clearly is that debt is being used for investment, but the efficiency of investment in countries that are borrowing the most is the lowest. So we are wasting most of the financial resources that we are raising. So let me end here by giving you another piece of data. We're here at the CEO Forum, but what is extremely preoccupying is investment has collapsed in Africa. Investment has certainly gone down, both foreign direct investment and domestic investment. So if you look at this chart, it's quite clear that the growth of investment has decelerated considerably over the past 4 or 5 years. But also the source of investment has changed considerably. Most of the investment coming to Africa is actually going to extractives. The question is, where should we be investing to create more jobs for the youth? Is the investment that is coming to Africa actually going in areas that matter the most for job creation? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. So private investment, as we speak at the CEO Forum, private investment should certainly be directed towards those sectors that would help Africa diversify and create those jobs. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Albert. That was really illuminating and so much for us to go on. We have microphones ready, so if we could all just be ready to grab them. I encourage all of you to be interactive. Please interject if you feel you have something to comment on. We have about 38 minutes to get through so many macroeconomic issues. I also just have to mention Minister Rania Amashat from Egypt was meant to join us today, but unfortunately, she's only arriving after the panel will be done. We will surely miss her voice because Egypt is going to be quite dramatically impacted. I have to say I'm excited. I've got some bankers on the stage. I have a few economists, a former politician. We have so much to get through. And I think that, if we think about the inflationary impact, we think about the prognosis from the World Bank or the OECD, we're not heading into recession just yet, but it is a scary scenario that we're looking at. And it almost feels Sisyphean. One crisis happens and then we're barely out of, that unprecedented experience and we're heading into another unknown factor. But then again, what we say is, what should we be doing to try and mitigate this? And Paul, I want to start with you. You've got an interesting portfolio of 33 countries. I know you focus on Côte d'Ivoire, but let's talk about EcoBank as a whole. I guess the big criticism is that banks perhaps should have been playing a more active role, particularly when I look at smallholder farmers and how they should be engaging and investing in them. And perhaps we wouldn't be dealing with this dire situation of a lack of food. So given the macroeconomic environment, what are bankers doing right now to change our scenarios?
Thank you, Eleni. Let me just make a few comments on the macro situation first.
Yeah.
Because, so when I was listening to my friends and I was thinking that probably 10, 20 years ago, we could have made the same comments, actually.
Yeah. And it would have been exactly viable, right? It would have been the same.
Yeah, and the point here is to say that those are old problems for Africa. Those issues are old issues. We know that Africa has a limited fiscal space. We know that we need to move up into the value chain in terms of agriculture. We know that we have not been invested that much into agriculture for a long time. All those issues are old issues. The only thing that is new today is this is once again reminding us that we need to act. We need to deal with those issues.
Okay, so what are the action points on that? Because I think that if we had our farmers, right, 20 years ago getting inputs and access to credits that was affordable, maybe we would have be dealing with hardcore multinational commercial farmers as opposed to still commercial farmers.
So you need to provide them financing, indeed.
Yeah.
That's where we can play a role. You need to have that cooperation between private sector and public sector. And you need to invest into infrastructure as well.
Yes, yeah.
Starting by infrastructure, the point here is that investing into infrastructure is going to help Africa to gain into competitiveness. That's the main point. That's what we need to do. If we do that, we add additional funding, then we can begin to have impact on lives of Africans.
Okay, Lionel, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. As someone that now is, in the investment sector and as a former politician and you're an economist as well, when you hear these old problems constantly coming back, firstly, I want you to tell me about your pivot and what you're doing right now, and secondly, how you're ensuring that we make a dent in these old legacy issues so that we're not caught off guard again when a crisis occurs.
Est-ce que vous m'autorisez à parler en français?
Can we get headsets? Does everyone speak French? Is it just me? Okay, there we go. They're going to do a translation, so I'm fine.
Let's speak...
You can do half-half. I've got a translation in my ear. I'm fine.
Let's speak Canadian, going from French to English. I think the messages in the CEO Forum are very important because we have many decision makers of the continent, but also many foreign to the continent. and I think we have to be very clear. We have not, as underlined by the World Bank in terms of forecast, we have not a risk of recession when North America and probably the European Union are under this risk. We are in a far better situation compared to many countries, and this message has to be clear. We have, I think, maybe because I'm a banker, but as you said, former politician, briefly politician, I would say we have a macro-social issue, which is a bit different. If inequalities become such that we are unable to protect the most vulnerable populations, the most exposed to energy prices and food inflation, then we will have macro social and political issues. So there is a very sharp contrast in between the macroeconomics, where you have a lot of positives, and the social issues, and even the risk of going back to 2007, 2008, hunger-related riots. Les émeutes de la faim, ça existe. Et quand le prix de l'énergie est à $120, c'est-à-dire la même situation que 2008, il y a en effet des émeutes de l'énergie. Donc, je crois que nous n'avons pas tellement de problèmes macroéconomiques. Pourquoi on n'a pas tellement de problèmes macroéconomiques? I see that you are more comfortable if I try and speak English.
No, they're translating, so, but I got the point.
We have a lot of levers on this situation. First, the governance in Africa has been massively improved during the pandemics.
Yeah.
At every level. African Union, the special envoys negotiating for the debt, the SDR initiative worked with the European Union and the allocation of SDR, which is important, plus the voluntary allocation to come, hopefully, we have had a better governance. We had a good reactions in terms of creating the digital platforms to react for supply. And now we can use for collective efforts to supply some commodities which are scarce, as we have done in some health-related supplies, and so on. So we have learned a lot, and we are far more efficient in terms of collectively acting.
But we still have vulnerabilities, right? So when you see food and fuel prices increasing, you're talking about, potential unrest and inequalities being exacerbated. Yeah. And you gave me a lot, so I'm going to try and touch on all of your points as we move through the conversation. Bertrand, welcome. It's so good to have you on. Look, you're the former CFO at the World Bank, and it was funny because over that time, I'd read one of the articles and I resuscitated it, where you were talking about from billions to trillions. And you were the one that was talking about, we need to increase financing to Africa. We need to increase the effort we put in. And again, it feels like we're back at that point, right? Where so many African countries were left behind, and we're collateral damage in this war that's playing out, and we're even being asked to take sides. How are you seeing what is going on at the moment?
Well, thank you to remind me of this good billions to trillions memory. This is one of my big regrets. If I had patented that formula, I would be very rich today. It seems it has been used again and again, and not very well understood, unfortunately. But the point remained exactly the same 7 years later. I mean, I coined that formula for a report we prepared with the IMF, the World Bank, and all the international organizations to prepare for the SDG summit, for the summit in Addis on the Partnership for Development, and for the Climate Accord in Paris. And the idea is, well, we are committed to change the world. We made a collective commitment to have a resilient, sustainable, and inclusive economy. That was a 2015 commitment. But we did not really discuss whether our system was fit for purpose. we kind of expected that some invisible hand will find its way, because it was great to eradicate poverty, great to provide access to health, to water, etc. And we thought it would be nice, incremental, and work naturally. And now, here we are, 7 years later, and no, it's more of the same. Let's face it, I mean, some things have done, and Lionel has mentioned some of the progress. It's great. So I think now that we are in this situation where, as Albert described, we are in a deep crisis, let's face it. I mean, we can be positive, etc., but it's very tough. It's tough economically, it's tough socially, it's tough geopolitically. From whatever perspective you take, it's one of the most difficult moments we faced. But on the other hand, and that's, I owe this to my master, Michel Candessu, who has been the head of the IMF for many years. He told me, when there is no crisis, you don't change. When there is a crisis, you change a little. Now that you have many crises, we should change a lot. And that's precisely where I think we need to seriously consider these questions.
Are you happy with the way the World Bank and the IMF and generally global institutions have been?
No, I think, and again...
I haven't even finished asking the question, but you knew where I was going.
No, but my point is that the system has not really changed.
Okay.
We've done some little stuff, and again, the SDR is a positive, etc. But have you seen the massive change that was required by the massive change of circumstances? No. No, I think it's important, because when we discuss macroeconomic, you have the short-term issue, which are well presented, and I don't have any capabilities to discuss the fiscal framework, etc. But I think what is important for the macroeconomic is a long-term perspective, the mid to long-term. How do you prepare for the future? And what gives me hope is that Africa, for the 21st century, is not part of the problem, is probably at the heart of the solution. The demographic issue of the world, the carbon issue. I mean, that's in Africa where you can offset carbon. That's in Africa you can produce the necessary hydrogen that is needed for the transition. That's in Africa you will find the rare earths, etc. So a lot of things will happen in Africa. But for this to work, you need Africa at the table. You need Africa to work. And that's where I'm a little worried. And let me finish with two comments. I have really two anxieties today. The first one is that there are a lot of things being discussed outside of Africa, norms and standards. I'm focused on impact investment, ESG. Everybody wants to do green, everybody wants to do this type of things. This is being discussed in Brussels and Washington. And this is very dangerous potentially for Africa. You know, just take the example of Kenya. Kenya is exporting flowers. Does it make sense, from the European perspective, to put flowers in a plane with CO2 emission to sell them in Europe? What is the backfiring impact for Kenya? This is real. And the second thing, and let me finish with that, where I think we have to address collectively the challenge is what I would call the shrinking of the horizon. I think today it started with America first. More and more people are restricting their horizon. They don't want to go too far away. They say climate, refugees, etc. This is too big for me. I want to invest in my village, in my company, in my family, in my territory, territoire, as we say in France. I've seen that in Europe and in America. So the critical issue is to convince people that Africa is there, that they need the money, that the billions to trillions is still working. Yeah. But this is not what we are seeing today. I think we have a real challenge how to make sure people are attracted. And we should not fool ourselves by just empty formulas. I think it's absolutely critical. If not, the regionalization will really not work in Africa's direction.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. Georges, great to have you on. I have to ask you, you know, as an African working at a multinational bank, I'm curious to find out what conversations you have about perceptions of risk about the continent, whether those have changed and deteriorated since these crises have emerged. And I want to be cognizant that when the Federal Reserve or, you know, we see the ECB raising rates, that has an impact on sort of the risk aversion for specifically emerging markets as a whole. And I'm curious to find out what those conversations are that you're having to try and debunk the fears with the Europeans.
Thank you very much, Eleni. Thanks for having me. I'd like to step back a bit and maybe comment on a few things that Albert said earlier, because there's an urgency in Africa today and we need to address it. I'll come back to your question, but I would like to just point a few facts and figures about the Africa situation today. The COVID crisis has pushed between 30 to 40 million Africans into poverty. And I think these are the World Bank studies saying that. In addition to that, the Russia and Ukraine crisis may push an additional 5 million Africans into poverty. So we need to act now. There's an urgency to act. I hear Lionel saying that Africa is certainly in a better position than many other regions in the world, but we are seeing hikes in inflation. Me as a banker, and I'm sure Paul Harry is the same, sees every day clients coming looking to restructure their facilities because they're having issues repaying them. So there is an urgency to act and act now. And that action needs to take place at different levels. First of all, governments need to play their part in readjusting their expenditure to and revenue equation. We've seen a number of governments taking certain measures already by way of subsidies or reviewing the cost of government expenditures and so on. But there are other things that need to be done, and that's where the international community could come in. We need to look at the cost of debt, which is today weighing very heavily in the balance sheet of our countries.
I want to touch on that because just if you could give me a little bit more analysis. You said, clients are coming to you and asking you to restructure. And does that mean that you're anticipating more corporate defaults? Is that what you're concerned about right now? Are you looking at government debt? What is the
what is clear is that if nothing is done, given what has been described, going from the COVID situation with the disruption in supply chains, delays in importations and so on, the impact on our clients have been huge. And as bankers, we see that every day. So we need to address those issues, and governments, I was saying, have a part to play. We bankers have also a part to play in providing solutions to those clients to ensure they don't fall into the trap of bankruptcy, and give them solutions for that. We also have situations where foreign direct investors have to come in and play a bigger part in our African continent today. What do they look for? They look for high returns, and we can have high returns in Africa. They look for stable and good governance. And as been said earlier, there are better governance in Africa going forward, but we still have issues on governance, and we have to address that with the African governments and see how they can improve on governance to attract more investment, and more investment in different areas. Albert said that investments come more and more into the extractive sectors, into the financial sectors, into the trade sectors. What about agriculture? Yeah. We are talking about food independency. The Ukraine crisis has shown a significant weakness in our agriculture mindset in Africa. How do we fix that?
Okay, but isn't it because it's viewed as a lot more risky, the agri-sector, don't you think?
I may say a few words about that. I think we have a couple of issues on the agri-sector. One is, and I'm saying this, I hope some of our governance would be here. One is about the security of our lands. I will not invest in a country where I do not know whether the land I purchase will belong to me in 10 years from now. So land registry is a major issue in Africa. And we've seen progress in some of the countries, but there's still a lot to be done in fixing that issue. If we have to have large investments coming into farms to grow cereals for our economy, we need to ensure that people are safe when they acquire lands in our continent. Okay. So that's one of the main issues we have in attracting foreign investment in agriculture. I'll come back to your question in 30 seconds.
We can do that later because this is so much more interesting.
Yeah, because it's more practical and it's more pragmatic and it's more needed right now.
While we're on the momentum on this, I really want to touch on this, Albert, because I guess that sometimes we see cooperatives feeding into a processor, and then that is sort of the agricultural model that seems to work, and then you're moving away from primary farming. What do you think the agriculture model should be then to try and increase food production? Because I don't think land reform and policy is going to happen quick enough, my fear is.
So, Eleni, let me just give you one number. 83%, I repeat, 83% of the poor in Africa live from subsistence agriculture. We cannot continue in that model. It's obvious it's generating poverty.
But how do we get those subsistence farmers to feed in to a wider story, right? So you've got those farmers being part of a cooperative. No, it's not viable.
No, Eleni, I think we need to get out of subsistence agriculture. Subsistence, rent-fed agriculture is the source of poverty in Africa. We need to be clear about that. There's nothing glorious about, conserving poverty. There's nothing glorious about that. We need to be clear. Africa is the only region in the world where people rely on the rain
but
to
you
grow
take
food.
away the opportunity
therefore-
to do subsistence farming. How are you going to replace that income stream for that person? I'm being the devil's advocate here.
Absolutely. What is critical here is we need to boost productivity of agriculture by investing, not spreading more subsidies. If you look at expenditure, public expenditure in agriculture for African countries, most of it goes into subsidies, not on investment and innovation that would drive productivity up. If we do that and more, productivity will rise, more people would actually leave agriculture into more productive activities, but those who stay would actually be better off.
Okay, so who wants to touch on that? Okay.
Can I?
And then line.
I think the point on subsidies is a very powerful one. And of course, we need to do proper policies. And the point is not to say that we don't have to pay attention to the weak in the society. But when you're a continent that is importing, and at the same time you are paying subsidies, this is a double punishment. And what we need to do is to see how we can divest from subsidies and invest into innovation and productivity. And that is massive, that is important, that's what we need to do. And this is going to be done not only with the government, but also with the banks. The banks have to be part of the financing system that could help finance innovation into agriculture. Two facts that is important just to see, and that
But
is...
if a farmer comes, knocks on your door today, and they say, listen, I need some money. Yes, I'm small, but I need some money. Are you going to help them with inputs?
So 20 years ago, that question, I would tell you, I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Today, with technology, there are many things that can do in terms of providing financing to farmers that is new. And that is the new Africa that Lionel was talking about. Something has changed about Africa. And we need to make sure that from a technology perspective, we use massively the technology to see how we can improve productivity and from data, provide more financing to the farmers.
Lionel, you wanted to touch on this.
Oui. On réessaye en francophone, une seconde. Pourquoi je pense que l'Afrique est beaucoup plus résiliente dans cette crise, comme elle l'a été dans la pandémie, par rapport à tous les préjugés qu'on pouvait avoir. Nous n'avons pas été les plus grandes victimes de la pandémie, nous n'allons pas être les plus grandes victimes des conséquences collatérales sur l'Ukraine. Pour une raison simple, c'est que nous sommes des exportateurs dont les prix à l'exportation en matière de matières premières minérales aussi bien qu'agricoles s'affirment fortement. Il y a une étude de l'UMOA qui montre que l'inflation de nos exportations est supérieure à l'inflation de nos importations. On regarde tout le temps l'Afrique comme important du blé, des oléagineux et étant menacée, des engrais et étant menacée. Elle est, en termes de l'échange, en amélioration par rapport aux années précédentes. Nous sommes aussi des producteurs d'hydrocarbures, nous sommes aussi sur l'ensemble des métaux, nous sommes aussi sur l'or, nous sommes aussi sur le coton dans ce pays, sur le cacao dans ce pays, sur le café, en inflation qui, cette fois-ci, nous profite. Donc faire un tout petit peu attention, nous allons avoir probablement des problèmes sociaux, d'ailleurs urbains ou périurbains. We will have more problems in suburbs, than in our countryside. Why? Because the agricultural incomes are going up in many sectors in our continent. It's not just that we have the shock from outside. We have a better situation in terms of trade. So it will accelerate the investments in technology, in green technology, in renewable energy. And both can go at a fast rhythm. The renewable energy, in terms of supplying the necessary energy for agriculture, for manufacturing of food, the products, cold chain, logistics, can be deployed far, far faster And it's easier to finance by these distinguished gentlemen. What you do in renewable can be deployed in 1 year. Yeah. And technically, it's less long than structuring the financing itself. You can deploy very fast. So you will have a very strong reaction in terms of technology and energy and water supply available for agriculture. So we are on the edge of probably a step change in terms of productivity in agriculture, which is triggered by this effect of dynamics linked to the crisis, but by the fact also that you have had a financial revolution. The governor of the Central Bank of Kenya alluded to that. We have a revolution in terms of microfinance, again, in strict correlation with SocGen, with EcoBank, refinancing it, with the central bank having refinanced it. But remember, the microfinance is the working capital supplier of small craftsmen and agriculture. So we have the tools for the dynamic.
Okay, we've got the tools. We need to put them to work. I want us to be realistic because we're talking about these macro issues, right, and how to solve them. And by the way, I've been having these conversations for many years, and they sound, the urgency, now's the time. And then we were seeing incredible growth levels. We were going, we've got it now. We've got great FDI, and then it just seems that it was just constantly false dawns. We've been making changes, and I agree that we're seeing huge shifts. But this tectonic shift that we're on the cusp of huge efficiencies in agriculture, what do we need to see today, firstly from the business people in the audience that want to invest, number one, number two, from the bankers on our panel, and then number three, from governments and policymakers who are so slow to sign these documents, right, to make these changes. Let's talk urgency and let's be real about what we actually need. Who wants to start? Bertrand, should we start with you?
No, I will repeat what I said. We have to be first to persuade ourselves and then to persuade the others that Africa is critical for the 21st century. I think this is the starting point. This is important, and that it's not Africa that is designed, but Africa is self-designing itself as central for this century. I think it's important to not accept the fact that the world is getting fragmented, that things do not connect or connect less and less. And so it's absolutely essential to reiterate everything we've said. Agriculture is a very good example. I think, I agree with Lionel, we are potentially on the verge of a big change in agriculture. For many years, agriculture has been le parent pauvre.
So what's the timeline? This potentially on the curve.
Sorry?
What's the timeline of this potentially on the curve of change?
I'm always nervous because being French, when you say it's urgent, people say, well, you French, you like to have a revolution, you expect that there will be a grand soir, you clack, and then overnight things are changing. No, we have to have the right combination of being very ambitious because this is a long-term change. I mean, this will not happen overnight. It's happening, and it's a 10, 20-year story. At the same time, we have to be very modest because this is taking time and the environment is not that favorable. But where it's important is to really, and again, I don't want to feel obsessed by this question of norms and standards, but apply to agriculture. Again, if we have too strict standards, international standards for agriculture, you will have a big problem. I mentioned the flowers, but you have the issue, which is a big sensitive things of child labor. Whenever you have the hint of child labor, people stop. And you have, when you use the bad fertilizers, it's bad, etc. So we have all these things that could be on the negative side. On the positive side, if you adjust to these changes, if you adopt the technological changes that are happening and which are less and less expensive and make a more and more difference, then you can really work in that direction.
George.
Yeah, I think what we need to do, to answer your question, Elena, first of all, from a very short-term perspective, governments need to take the lead to shield away their populations from this trend of poverty that is showing up. And we've talked about some fiscal measures that government needs to put in place. We need to promote Africa more. This is the time for Africa to actually get some sort of its independence in many aspects. We need to rely more on funds that are raised out of the continent versus external debt. We do have a lot of potential on the continent. We can develop our capital markets to actually tap into that potential to raise funds to finance those critical projects that the continent needs to make the next leap. We need to promote the African continent. Let me tell you something. We at Société Générale, and I can say this, we have not have one single default in any large structured transaction over the past 10 years. Zero default. And I don't think many regions in the world can say that. Yeah. So this perceived risk of Africa can only be perceived at times.
So then, can you answer my first question then? Do you have to remind the bankers in France?
Yeah, I do tell them that, and we share the data. I mean, the data is available. The other thing we need to do is to accelerate the building of the local competencies. Because one of the things that we have been lacking in the continent in the past decades was the competencies to actually originate and drive those structural transactions that actually make the difference. We have, for our bank, and I'm sure EcoBank did the same, we have been developing a lot of local competencies to actually drive those key projects. So in short, we need to accelerate the independence of Africa so that we are less vulnerable to those shocks that actually happen abroad. Lionel said it. COVID was not from Africa. It came from away. The Ukraine crisis is not in Africa. Why should we be having those crises impact Africa more than other regions? We have to accelerate our independence, and on those different fields, government...
We're stuck in the middle, right? And that's the thing. Paul, I have to ask you this. The banks were so instrumental, actually, in assisting companies and individuals during the pandemic, and we actually don't give you guys enough credit, I think. and thank you for that, by the way, because I've been covering these stories for the past few years. So then, what is the bank's role going forward to helping elevate the continent like we need, so we can create these macroeconomic buffers that we need? Because we're running out of tools, right? I think everyone else can just spend their way out of a crisis, but the continent doesn't have the ability to do that.
So there are three things that I think we can do. The first one is, and I'm referring to technology again, which is something that is important. So we have set up the AFCFTA, and behind the AFCFTA, you have the payment system, which is the African payment system.
So the PAS.
The PAPS.
Yeah, PAPS, yeah.
Yeah, because when you start trading, you need to pay, right? If you are trading, you need to pay. So we need to have an African payment system that can help someone sitting in Maputo to sell to a customer in Dakar. That's the purpose. The only way to do that is to leverage...
Is that to replace SWIFT, for example?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's going to be the African SWIFT. That's the purpose. If you do that, then you don't need to go to hard currencies to do transactions. So the purpose of having that is massively important in terms of the step changes that Lionel is talking about. So that's one of the things that I think banks have to promote. And EcoBank, with the switch that we have, which is the only Pan-African switch that does exist, can provide that back end to the PAPS to make it effectively from day one. The second thing that banks need to do as well is to help in all the conversations about the risking, credit enhancements. Those conversations, bank can help. And that's where we need the support from the government to see how they can provide that scheme, that environment to promote credit enhancement. Lastly, which is a conversation that we don't usually have, on the funding matter, what is missing the most is not debt. And I think George was referring to that a little bit. What is missing is equity. Yeah. How can we get more equity into Africa? And let's have a frank conversation. Let's reduce our dependency to equity coming from outside. What we need to work on is to make sure that we have local equity pools, leveraging from the pension funds, and we need to bring the insurance firms to the party as well, to make sure that all those institutions can provide the needed funding to make those changes.
Fantastic. Okay, I don't want to get anyone into trouble, but here's a question I really need answered. And I'll come to you now, Albertine. You can add any comments you have. We are clearly seeing polarization happening globally. You know, emerging markets taking sides, and some would say, some choosing not to take any sides, some pretty much voicing that they are, you know, just focused on their economies and not wanting to get involved. But it's almost like you're seeing this push by the West, take a side. You're seeing a push by China and perhaps Russia, take a side. And you're seeing these sort of displays politically of people meeting. And one has to wonder where Africa sort of sits in all of this. Because there's been a lot of criticism for African countries not making a stance against the war against Russia and Ukraine. Do you think that Africa needs to make that decision? African countries are taking the right approach? And is this going to result in polarization? Who wants to handle that? Bertrand, you're the only one that can't get into trouble, at least not anymore.
Well, I'm not sure the question actually is addressed to Africa. The question should be addressed to the West. And to see why is it so? And this is coming to my point. If the West is putting a number of rules, norms, standards, etc., which are not appropriate for everything we've discussed, then it's absolutely normal that people won't take sides. It's true in Latin America, it's true in Africa for exactly the same reason. People don't feel comfortable with the system as it is. So I think it's an important, in particular for Europe as far as Africa is concerned, to listen to that and say, okay, we have committed to an inclusive economy, and stop talking about inclusivity and start being inclusive. I think this is really the name of the game. I think we really have to embrace everything and help. It's not just transferring money, etc. It's everything, all the systems, the ecosystems, the norms, the standards, the approach I've been discussing, which are critical. It's also, and that's going to be challenging, it's also to push investors, as I say, to expand their horizon. I'm very nervous about the fact that people are willing to stay on their comfort zone, to put their money at home. And that's probably one of the big threats that the emerging market is facing. The people say it's too complex, we don't understand, etc. Yeah. I keep my money in America, I keep my money in Europe, and I consider what comes next. So I think this is really where, again, it's not to Africa to make up its mind between the West, China, or whatever. It's really, if the West wants to make a difference, they have to come and say, okay, guys, let's discuss what is really at stake today. You are essential for the future, and I believe that. You're part of the solution to our problem. How do we get there together? And we don't do that today. We do more of the same. So I think this is really, now is the time to really change. I hope the European Union, Africa Union Summit was a starting point. Not sure yet. But this is the type of initiative that should accelerate.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to do closing comments now. But Albert, I'm going to start with you and then you, Lionel.
Yeah. Eleni, I think this is a very, very interesting discussion. And this kind of forum should also help changing the narrative about Africa. When COVID hit, most medias in the world expected naturally the catastrophe in Africa.
100%.
Now, even for Ukraine, what we're hearing is, oh, it's going to be a disaster in Africa. Everything on earth tends to be, expected to cause catastrophe in Africa. And I think one thing that Lionel was, the point he was making is in terms of macroeconomic performance, Africa has actually done better than the rest of the world. And let's put the facts right there. Growth is better in Africa than in the rest of the world, despite Africa not having really expanded the fiscus, right? Advanced countries have spent 17% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus. Africa is 2.8%, and the rest of the developing world only 4%, right? So there is only that much we can do in terms of continuing to propagate that Africa is a disastrous place. But let me come to the next point and to your question. I think people also expect Africa to sit and do what they expect. This is the opportunity for Africa to also start asking, where is our interest? And I think it's important. Until Africa starts saying, where is my interest in the global economy, I think we will not actually be able to grow sustainably. And let me just give you an example. For 20 years, Africa's contribution to global trade has been below 3%. It's been below 2% for global export. And if you look at exports of manufacture, Africa contributes only 1%. I call it the 3-2-1 paradox. This is crazy. This is time for Africa to say, okay, what is in it for us, right? And we should ask that question for all. Now, let me just say a couple of things that we need to do to get out of this, triple crisis that I have described. The first thing we need to do, frankly, is to start investing. We cannot grow if we're not investing, and investment is going down. And I'm here calling on all the CEOs. It's not about trade, it's about investment. And for investment to take off, governments need to create the right infrastructure and the right investment climate. We cannot invest if there is no electricity. I travel across the continent, there are very few capitals where you can actually have reliable and affordable electricity. How are we going to produce? How are we going to move to that industrialization that we are all talking about? So the digital economy, we need to invest in the digital. That's the future, and that's the future for jobs as well. Are our banks financing those basic infrastructure for the future? I'm asking here my colleagues, bankers here on this panel, and my answer is no, they're not.
Strategically put you in the middle between two bankers.
They're not.
Listen, we've completely run out of time. I'm getting shouted at. Lionel, you've got 30 seconds. You wanted to say something.
I'm a bit less anxious than Bertrand, because in 2021 we had the record of international inflows of capital, the record, historical. Same from the remittances of the diaspora. So we have some flows which are positive. On what is to be done, empower the private sector, because the growth that the World Bank has forecasted will be delivered by the private sector, from the farmer to every corporate, and from the microfinance to the largest Pan-African bank. And as far as the governments are concerned, you have not to say outside of this room, but the private sector delivers more efficiency than the public sector. When you come from one side to the other. But for the public authorities, how to mitigate the risks of poverty of the most vulnerable. What are the safety nets that we have put in place and experienced 2 years ago? And how to enlarge that. So for the public sphere, it's far more the macro-social risk. But the private sector will deliver the macroeconomic performance.
Lionel, we've run out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for my fantastic panel. I have to say that if you were all a political party in one political party, I would hands down vote for you guys. I think you're action men. And I am so proud to know that you're leading institutions and making changes on the ground. We need these voices. Thank you so very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. See, I told you guys to sit down and get ready for this panel. This is why. It was absolutely fantastic.